Welcome to Establish the Edge. I'm your host, Mike Leone, back for an episode today to look at wide receiver and tight end targets. Similar episode to what I did last week. Going to make this a weekly thing. Before I get into that, I want to note that this podcast is brought to you by Underdog Fantasy. So if you go over to Underdog Fantasy, they've got weekly contests for DFS going on, which you can play the Battle Royale. We've got rankings for that on Establish the Run. We also have rankings for the rest of the season best ball contest, the Resurrection. So a couple of different ways to play over on Underdog Fantasy. If you sign up and use promo code ETR, you will get up to $100 match on your initial deposit. So definitely check that out. And again, use promo code ETR when signing up at Underdog Fantasy to get to $100 match on your initial deposit. So the good news is things are a little bit less busy for me now. So I'm going to be hitting multiple episodes a week, like I noted. The bad news is I've been sick this week, my first week of scaled down stuff. So if I don't sound quite right, that is why. But powering through it, I'm going to have 3 episodes for you this week and hopefully 3 episodes each week. I'm going to do one looking at underperforming pass catchers, which is today's episode. Same thing that I did last week. And then applying the same methodology essentially to running backs. So we'll have a second episode on underperforming running backs, and then a third episode looking at the GPP game scores that Adam Roush helped us develop over at Establish the Run. Adam will be joining me Thursday evenings. We'll recap what happened last week and then take a look ahead at the ETR GPP game scores for the upcoming week and how things might move and the types of games we may be targeting to help get in the GPP mindset for the week. But yeah, let's look at last week's results from the Buy Leone. And if you didn't listen to last week's episode, I kind of explained what the Buy Leone model is, which is a model that I developed to try and find wide receivers and tight ends that are underperforming based on their opportunity. And the good thing about this model is it's very objective. It's simply based on the opportunity. There's no subjective, this guy's bad, this guy isn't good. So it's a really nice check to kind of our more subjective projection system process. The negatives, of course, are it assumes the same opportunity going forward. And the removing player skill is like a good thing and a bad thing. It's just something you need to be aware of with the model. Let me see, trying to share my screen here, but having some issues, of course. But last week, Devonta Adams was someone that we mentioned. Oh, here we go. Present screen. I was tricked by the new StreamYard setup here, but you can see here are the results from last week. Of the guys we mentioned, Devonta Adams, who I was really into, hit a pretty good game, putting up 19. Oh no, he put up 19.1 fantasy points. Ironically, that was pretty much exactly our DFS projection for the week. He did not find the end zone, but again, Devonta Adams continues to crush, and we actually have him in my expected points model. I have him right in line with Cooper Kupp. These guys are seeing like very similar stuff. Kupp has a little bit more in terms of pure targets. Adams has more red zone targets, believe it or not, and a little bit more air yards. Have those guys each at around 86 expected fantasy points through 4 weeks. Adams has underperformed. He's at 73 fantasy points. Kupp's at 100. I do expect Kupp to outscore Adams. He's had an absurd catch rate for 2 straight seasons. A little bit less uncertainty with him, but think that gap will shrink and that Adams really has a pretty realistic chance to finish the year as a top 3 wide receiver, maybe even the wide receiver 2 overall. Another guy we were looking at last week was Brandon Cooks. And again, we get the catch rate regression for Cooks. Cooks, I think, he had 100% catch rate in the game. And then, of course, he goes from, his 9.6 points per game is what he was averaging going in. He finishes with 18.7, also had a DPI that he drew, and he had a 22-yard catch called back from holding. Metcalf had a really strong game, was someone that we highlighted. Was a pretty big hit. One guy who we did touch on last week that was not a hit was Kyle Pitts. And you're going to see a lot of people that recur on the model when they don't perform well, if they keep getting the opportunity. Pitts is one of them. He's second in tight end air yards on the season. I still think it's going to happen for Pitts. Atlanta's only averaged under 25 pass attempts per game. They're a team I'm very worried about the overall pass volume, but they're going to be worse in terms of game script. They've had some fluky games where they're 2-2 And one of the losses they led by a ton. Another one of the losses they like blocked a field goal and returned for a touchdown and lost a possession. They've just had some weird things that they're going to be a low pass attempt team. But by that, I think I mean like 30, 34, somewhere in that range, 30 to 34 pass attempts per game. Certainly not less than 25. And Pitts should just start running more routes too, which is just something bewildering. Do think it's worth noting though that um, when we're thinking about uncertainty in the offseason, a lot of times we chase uncertainty because the upside along with it. And I think that perhaps went too far with Kyle Pitts. We're like, oh, what if he's just the best tight end ever? Especially when you got to the point where you're rating Pitts like potentially ahead of Mark Andrews. That's something we didn't do at ETR. I think at that point, one of the reasons uncertainty is profitable is because the market's so afraid of uncertainty that you get a good price. When you don't get that good price, uncertainty can even become a bad thing. And we're seeing some things with Kyle Pitts in terms of the pass rate for Atlanta. We're seeing some things in terms of his usage because Arthur Smith just does not seem like that good of a coach that are results of uncertainty that Mark Andrews didn't have. There was no way some of the bad things that are happening to Kyle Pitts would have ever happened to Mark Andrews because we knew what his role was going to look like. So just want to make that point about uncertainty. At a certain point, you do need to catch yourself and not just be blinded by the upside case for a player when when the profitability of the uncertainty is priced in. I do think that happened with Pitts. I still think he's running bad. I still think he was a good draft target overall, but it's just something that struck to me when when I'm looking at the things that are going wrong with Pitts and I'm comparing him to Mark Andrews. I think there's a world certainly where Pitts outscores Mark Andrews, but there's not really a world where the routes get scaled back, and some of these things that are happening with Kyle Pitts, they wouldn't have happened to Mark Andrews. So wanted to note that. Those were the guys I think we mostly talked about last week. Some of the other big hits in the model, TJ Hawkinson, of course, goes off. A lot of that was context related, though, with the really good matchup against Seattle and all the other pass catchers being out for Detroit, which the model doesn't know. So certainly some run good and some luck there. Zach Ertz with a big performance, and that tight end role for Arizona has been so valuable. He just gets so many like freebie catches each week, and then he gets bombarded with red zone targets. So I've actually put in some sneaky bids on Trey McBride, who's finally found the field for Arizona, in the hopes that if he can get this role towards the end of the season, even if DeAndre Hopkins comes back, so I think it's extremely valuable tight end role when you look at the garbage at tight end from other positions. Some big misses. Diontae Johnson was a huge miss. Going to talk about him more in a little bit. Marvin Jones was somewhat weather related. Dalton Schultz somewhat health related. Those were some of the big misses. Ayuk misses, and he falls off the model. And do want to Elijah Moore, I'd kind of pointed out last week that I was a little skeptical. He's on the model again this week, but I'm still skeptical about Moore for two reasons. Again, the pass rate for the Jets, the total pass volume has to come down, and this model assumes the same volume going forward. And Garrett Wilson just continues to emerge and kind of be ahead of Elijah Moore. So I think Moore is going to be okay, but he's not someone that I'm really strongly going after. So let's take a look at the stuff this week and the guys I'm interested in. Devonta Adams, you can see, is at the top again, and absolutely love him, but not too much more to add about him that we haven't already talked about. Jamar Chase, though, is like he's going to explode. And if you can, I don't know what you can get from him in trade. It's unfortunate that he's in a night game and we can't play him on the DFS main slate this week. But if anyone's starting to sour on Jamar Chase a little bit, I think I would trade Tyreek Hill for Jamar Chase. I'm trying to think some other overperforming wide receivers, but or maybe a package deal where you go 2 for 1 and you get the better player if people are like somewhat down on Chase, because I'm actually really encouraged by the usage for Chase early on. His target rate is up overall. He's seen over 10 targets per game. The issue is his yards per target is now 4 yards or so from last year. If we take a look, Jamar Chase, who's at 11.4 yards per target last year, only 7.1 this season. Part of that's ADOT related. His average depth of target is down, but we should see a corresponding increase in catch rate if that's the case. And so far it's down. So I think we're going to see one of two things, maybe a combination of both, happen moving forward, which is he's either going to catch more balls if his ADOT stays low, or his ADOT's going to start to regress towards what it was last year, and we'll see a little bit more explosiveness. I think something between the two. And he's also only caught a touchdown on 1 out of 20 passes or so, when last year he caught a touchdown on 1 out of like 13 passes. So look for him to bounce back. And when I look at the player comps for Jamar Chase for this week, really good matchup against Baltimore. Again, when you're looking at this graph on the player comps, if you're watching on the YouTube channel, you can see it. Just keep in mind that these scales on the x-axis are different for different players because the upside isn't as big. So this might look like it's left-tailed a little bit, but that's actually a pretty high 20th percentile outcome for him, which is double-digit points. A lot of guys at single-digit points. And also, he just has such massive upside. You get an 80th percentile outcome in the high 20s, but you get a really, really big right tail. And some of his comps include a 34-point Justin Jefferson game, which was actually the Jefferson game that he just had last week. You got a 32-point Chase game, which is reflective of Chase's week 1 this season. There's a 28-point Terry McLaurin game from week 9 of 2020. There's a 45-point Tyreek Hill game from week 2 of this season. So some really high-end comps. There's also a 29-point Calvin Ridley game in here. He's going to get you double-digit points almost every week, and there's going to be a few weeks a year where he just completely goes off. We haven't had one of those. We're going to get those. So stay patient with Jamar Chase. The explosion is coming. Now let's look at Deontay Johnson. Deontay, his comps are a little bit more stable, a little bit less upside, but still pretty good overall. 20th percentile outcome, almost in the double digits, median just under 15 points, and an 80th percentile in the low to mid 20s for Deontay Johnson. And the reason, for Deontay Johnson being on the mile this year is he continues to earn targets. He's earning, almost 10 targets a game. But we thought, the efficiency couldn't get worse going from Ben Roethlisberger to Mitch Trubisky. We were wrong. Mitch Trubisky, absolutely awful. And as a result, we've seen a lower yards per target for Diontae Johnson, despite the fact that his ADOT has increased. So I'm pretty excited to see what happens with Kenny Pickett. The increase in ADOT for Diontae Johnson, along with him continuing to earn targets, actually points to maybe a little bit more upside than we might think here, especially relative to how bad the production has been early. So I'm still buying Diontae Johnson. He is on my bench in some of these where I'm deep at wide receiver, though. I think I'm playing Jerry Jeudy ahead of him in the league. So it's tough. Jeudy also on the list for this week, by the way. And with that quarterback switch, do also want to know that George Pickens had 156 air yards last week. Pickens is someone that should absolutely be owned in all formats. I dropped him in a league last week where I had a really deep bench, and I wanted to pick up Kadarius Toney for a bit more upside, and sort of regretting that now, trying to get George Pickens back in that format. So should be owned everywhere. Okay, another guy to look at is Chris Godwin. Godwin had an 83% snap share last week for the Bucks, and that was great to see Godwin come back and post that huge snap share. We didn't know exactly how healthy he was. Of course, he hurts his hamstring week 1, and we were kind of like, why did you rush him back from the ACL? But he comes back early. Comps for him this week aren't super great, but I'm really in on him. We also saw the pass rate over expectation for the Bucks get back to where we thought it would be, and it makes sense because partly due to game script against Kansas City, but keep in mind pass rate over expectation takes into account the game script, but there's still a mental aspect of the opponent you're playing on that certainly made Tampa Bay play more aggressively than they may have versus someone else, even with the same score differential. But mostly what we saw is the health of the wide receivers led, and the inefficiency of the run game just led Tom Brady to throwing all game. They're like a 90% pass rate. The expectation was high, but not nearly that high. And consistently, they've been one of the highest PROE teams each week. So I'm super excited for Chris Godwin this week and moving forward. He's an absolute slam right now. I would be trying to get him in all leagues. Like this is going to be your last opportunity to get Chris Godwin. So make sure you check him out. At tight end, Darren Waller. We'll see if Hunter Renfrow remains out. That would obviously be good for Waller. I don't know if that's going to have a huge impact on his role overall. It's a pretty condensed passing tree for the Raiders. The total targets for Waller haven't been amazing. He's had 6, 8, 5, and 5 targets, and those 5 and 5 came with Renfro being out, and we kind of hoped those would be a little bit higher. The good news for Waller overall, even though the target share isn't super high, Devonta Adams is gleaning the targets. The base of like 5 targets is okay for a tight end. He's getting looks down the field. If you look at the NFL air yards leaders, he is third among all tight ends at 273, ahead of Travis Kelce by just a smidge. And his red zone role has been phenomenal. He has 7 red zone targets through 4 games. He has 2 in each of the last 3 games, yet he only has 1 touchdown. So I think those TDs could come in a hurry. He was close to at least 2 or 3 more touchdowns in some of the games that I watched, and the narrative around him would be really different had he caught those touchdowns. Also think like the yards per target 7.3 is gonna come up, given that the ADOT has risen to 11.5, which is high for him, and it's that ADOT is helping to make, again, going back to the air yards, is helping to make up for the fact that he's seen a little bit less volume overall. So pretty into Darren Waller. Some other guys that are underperforming on the list this week that I want to point out: Jerry Jeudy and Juju Smith-Schuster are 2 guys that I still like. I think they're holds in your leagues. What we've seen out of both of them, I think, is that they're going to be productive and they have a decent floor. We haven't seen the upside hit. And in some cases, that might mean the upside isn't there that we hoped was there in the preseason. These were 2 guys I was bullish on in the preseason, but it may just materialize further down. There's a lot of stuff with randomness and whatnot that could happen over the course of the season. So when I see guys that are doing okay as is, are popping on this list as underperformers, and I like them before the preseason, I'm still in on them, even though, like, intuitively, I do feel the ceiling has dropped off a little bit for Juju and Jeudy. Justin Jefferson's on the list because, prior to last week's smash, he had 2 really down games that are factored in the model. And it's looking at the last 3 fantasy points per game. That's what the comparison is to. But ultimately, there's just not too much to say here. You can't buy low on Justin Jefferson anywhere. He's an absolute stud. Whenever there's studs on this list, I'm paying really close attention because it means, rocket ships moving forward compared to where they have been. And that's the same thing for Justin Jefferson, who's been really up and down to start the year. It may remain somewhat up and down, but I do think his weekly performance are made closer to week 1 and 4 than they were weeks 2 and 3. DJ Moore, another repeat guy on the list, who, again, the list doesn't know how bad Baker Mayfield has been and may continue to be, and how bad schematically this offense is. If you have DJ Moore, though, you're just holding firm, really. I think it could still happen for him, but I definitely prefer like Diontae Johnson, who's also on this list, over DJ Moore. Probably prefer, quite frankly, Juju Smith-Schuster and Jeudy, I think, to DJ Moore, but it's probably that same bucket. He's pretty similar to those guys. Not too much else at tight end, by the way. Hayden Hurst found the end zone for Cincinnati last year. He looks pretty good. I think he should be owned in most leagues, but there's not a ton there. So that's going to do it for this week's look at wide receiver and tight end underperformers. Again, I'll be back tomorrow doing the same thing for running backs, and also tomorrow evening looking at the game scores with Adam Rouse. So thank you so much for tuning in, everybody, and I hope you have an excellent week.